What a treat to be here. Thank you so much, Rory. And thank you so much for coming here. I love being part of something called Removing Barriers and Beyond the Classroom. Fantastic. So just because we are recording, please don't be shy about asking questions. I want to come to you, and if you've got a question burning away inside you, please ask it. We'll have a roving mic. We'd love to hear from you. Any question, no question is not allowed. So, yeah, love to hear from you. Mary, what a treat this is.
It is. I'm so pleased to be with you.
Me too. Me too. We could talk about many things, and I guess we'll talk a lot about your passion for, as a designer, creating spaces to help children learn. But I want to go back a little bit, back to the beginning of your interior design life. When you started interior design, so you came to Australia as a child, you studied design...
A £10 pom.
A £10 pom. Mm. So let's go back to childhood first of all. Did you have a sense of an interest in design as a little one in England?
Yes, I did. And it actually fascinates me, the passions that children get very early in life that can carry them through, and who knows where they come from. But mine, I realised, was about space. I referred to it as architecture, but it was actually about, it was a sort of visceral response to space. And growing up in London, I was fortunate to go to some pretty interesting spaces, I guess. And so that stayed with me, plus the fact that there was an architect who lived on, near us. And though my parents were both tradespeople with very little education, they both had a great respect for creativity, I think, and imagination. And so it was a real treat to go and visit this architect. And I laughingly refer to it, I think it was the smell of Derwent pencils that really got me in.
I think it got all of us.
It's a very special smell.
Yeah. I just bought a whole set. I, with my own money, was able to buy 72 Derwent pencils recently as an adult.
Yeah, so I think it was there from early on.
Mm. Mm. What spaces do you remember as a child that captivated you?
I remember going to the Tower of London, and I think it's something to do with connecting very emotional stories, historical events that happened in those spaces. And then I remember going into a cathedral on the way out. We came by boat, which took over a month to get from England to Australia at that time. And I remember going into this cathedral and the light was pouring in through coloured windows, and how excited that made me. Mm. So I eventually realised it wasn't, even though I thought I wanted to be an architect, I was actually more interested in the spaces that architecture creates.
And so you study interior design at RMIT. This is the 60s. What did you imagine your career would look like in the 60s as a young woman trying to forge her way into a career? Because this is, women's liberation hadn't happened yet, really, or it was on the cusp of it. So what did you imagine an interior design career would do for you?
I had no idea. No idea. No, and you're right. At that time, it was extremely difficult for a woman to have a career. It was living through the late 60s, 70s as a young woman that was incredibly exciting, because all the sorts of conventions, around family structures, women's roles, all of that was being questioned. And we were out on the streets, protesting and challenging politicians. It was very exciting. And I often look back on that time and think how lucky it was to live through that, because we started things, the whole, with a little group of us, started a whole network of children's services, unlike anything that had been done before. And it was that experience that made me feel anything's possible. you've got an idea, you want to change something, get together with a few mates, change the world.
And the community childcare movement was born.
Exactly.
Which was very liberating for women who wanted to forge careers.
Well, it was just a group of parents who wanted to continue their professions, but we couldn't. We were told, no, as soon as you marry, or certainly as soon as you have a kid, you've got to get out of the workforce. And so we came together and said, well, we actually want to keep going, but we want to make sure that the services that we put our kids into are going to be really good for them. And so we thought, well, if we could, if they were community-run services, and so what we did was to set up in houses, and so it would be staffed by parents together with professional staff. And what I realised early on was that because this was a whole new social structure, it needed a totally different physical environment. So Grant and I were successful in getting a research grant to really look at this. And
Grant being Grant Featherston, your
yes.
husband, famous modernist architect, designer.
Yes, and by that time we had one child. And so when I look back at my whole life has been a continuation of that sort of model of looking, at social needs, well, particularly around children, and then getting together with a group and initiating change. But design has always been a critical part of it. And I used to think, don't laugh, but I used to think that design could change the world. I don't think it does. No, I don't know.
Don't say that.
No, sorry. But it's vital. It's absolutely part of the picture, but it's vital to support change. You can't. There are many changes, and the things I've been involved in couldn't have changed without changing the physical environment.
Oh, I can't wait to drill into that further, because this idea that revolutions in design can also sow the seeds of social revolution, or vice versa, how they relate to each other. We'll come to that in a minute. But in a sense, the home that you created with your husband, Grant, which was designed by the famous modernist architect Robin Boyd, and there it is. Here it is in Melbourne. You're still living there. You've had 4 generations of family now through that house. Your mother, you, your children, your children's children. Amazing. And so it's an incredible house. It's a very famous house with these suspended platforms, a garden in the middle of it, inside. Just reflecting on that house and the partnership that you had with Grant, was that house sort of, did that allow you to do something that a lot of women couldn't do, which was work at home, have this incredible creative collaboration with your husband, have your children at home? It was all happening in the one space, wasn't it?
And that's what we wanted from that. I mean, that was the brief that we gave Robin, that we wanted to totally integrate our personal and professional lives, although at that stage we didn't know what that really meant. A lot of people have discovered that during COVID, haven't they? And Grant didn't want to own a house. He didn't believe in owning property. So we looked for ages for something to rent that had, studio, darkroom at that time, because needed darkroom, workshop, store, as well as all the domestic spaces. And of course we couldn't find anything. So then Grant said, I think we should go to Robin. And they'd had a long association over, long before I knew Grant, they'd had a long association. So
I love that you couldn't find a rental, so you happened to build one of the most famous houses in Australia.
Well, at the time it just seemed, what you did.
Yeah.
And it wasn't expensive, I have to say.
Yeah. Right.
But Robin, as people here will be familiar, each of his houses was quite different, but very much an expression of the clients, the people who lived there. And the way he integrated what we said was that we wanted spaces that could be used for domestic life or as part of work. So the dining room was often a photographic studio. It was like an assembly line for making prototypes at one point. It's for kids playing. It's just been endlessly adaptable. Really. Mm.
Was it okay having children? Is it okay having children in a house full of suspended platforms hanging in the middle of a large space?
Yes.
Not potentially lethal?
Potentially, yes.
So
we also lived with tiger snakes, so did you? We lived dangerously. Yeah. But
you've got to tell me about the tiger snake.
Oh well, we live on a creek, and so that's inevitable. Yeah.
And it runs through the house. No,
it's not that bad. No, I think that so much of what I'm going to talk about is hindsight. Somebody said hindsight is, what was it, retrospective coherence. That's right. So I look back and I think, oh yes, of course, it all adds up. It's all of a piece. But the reality is, at the time, you're living it, and it gradually turns into something. So when our first son was born, we knew nothing about children at all, either of us. So, I was quickly trying to understand a bit more about child development. And
sweeping the tiger snakes out of the nursery.
Yeah. But just watching kids and people responding to the space was extraordinary. Robin talks about the need for architecture to lift the human spirit. And really you can see that as people come through the front door. It's, and kids just go wild for a start, and parents are trying to, settle them down. But what happens is that they explore, because that's what they're programmed to do, is to explore every nook and cranny, and then they would settle down somewhere and get into something. And so then gradually I noticed that they would settle down doing something that was totally engaging, and they'd be there for hours, and they might, call on us to get something. So it was highly imaginative and witty and all of those things. And so I formed this view about children, well, that's what they are. And then when I hit the school system, I thought, but hang on, how did you arrive at a school for children and expect them to behave quite differently to what I'd observed of children in the house?
So this is key, isn't it? Because you had your first child in 1970, I think, and so you then make your way into the school system. And what did you discover? You discover the traditional school we're also familiar with: corridors, long corridors, classrooms, sort of splaying off them, rows of desks and chairs, a teacher up the front. Where did that come from, that model?
Oh, it has long history, and it's based on beliefs and values about children and learning. So, when the mass education system was designed, it was based on the view that it was important to convey a body of knowledge, essential skills, to young people as efficiently as possible. So you can look at the model of the Industrial Revolution, the motor driving or one motor driving many, and so you've got the teacher who is transmitting information
to the passive recipient,
to the passive children, and then what's more, you say, well, it's not terribly interesting, so we'll have to break it up into chunks, and we'll have to break the time up into chunks so they don't get bored, so keep moving them on. But the interesting thing is, every day it seems I find another reason why the design of the physical environment is so closely related to these values. So the design of the classroom is absolutely, fit for purpose for that approach to learning and children.
So what are the values? The child is the passive recipient, the teacher is the all-knowing, all-powerful, the almighty up the front.
Oh, and that it is possible to transmit information from an adult head to a child head. And even more than that, it's possible to do that to a group of, well, originally it was more than 300, now, it's 20 to 30, but that it's possible to do that when we know that the children are at all different levels of understanding. I mean, it's absolute nonsense that is possible, but that's the value. So then I find it so interesting, the relationship between the these social systems, the physical environment, that it's a very complex system. But the thing that drives it all, that drives every element of it, are these core beliefs. So unless you change the core beliefs about children and learning, you're stuck with the model.
And so you were inspired by seeing the traditional classroom and how at odds it was with what you'd been observing about children in your own life, in your own home, to really spend the last 50 years revolutionising the way we think about the interior design of a classroom as a learning environment. And you've done extraordinary projects. Let's just go back to, though, a foundation of inspiration for you, and it's in northern Italy. And it was spearheaded by a group of parents after the war who didn't want to see kids compete with each other. They wanted to see collaboration in the classroom. This is a little town called, or a village,
Reggio Emilia.
Yeah.
Well, that part
this is Reggio Emilia.
Yeah, that part of northern Italy had experienced the most bitter civil war that went on after the end of the Second World War, and it divided families. It was cruel, and so at the end of that time, a group of parents decided that, they didn't, how could they save their children from going through this trauma? And they decided, well, we'll start by building a school. But they had no idea, how to do it. And this amazing psychologist, educator, Loris Malaguzzi, found them and was intrigued by what they were trying to do. And he said, well, I don't know either, but, I suggest we start by observing children. And from that, they've evolved this incredible... it's the only system I know in the world that has continuously evolved over decades.
So what's at the heart of it? Give people a sense of what learning looks like and why the environment, the classroom, is an educator.
Well, so what they said they discovered from observing children closely, and this has happened in other projects in other parts of the world as well, is that children are inherently curious. I mean, the fact is, they all come into the world like that.
Natural-born scientists.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
And in fact, early on, in going back to 1970, I was absolutely knocked over by reading that babies can hear very well 3 months before they're born, and they can see, they can pick up light before they're born, and incredible abilities. So then you say, and children in the main have a language before they even get to school. That's a pretty complicated thing to learn. So what the Reggio people said is, they're actually curious and capable. And, as parents, we know that. We see children exploring. That's the way. There's such a strong drive to make meaning of the world. So then our job is, the job of educators and designers, is to respond to that and say, they learn through all their senses, they learn actively, they like to learn socially, they learn experientially, then how do you respond to that? So, and that's, the way Reggio has developed. But they've also designed something which I think is quite wonderful, but it's very much like a design process. And I think it's like a scientific research process. So you start with a research question, what am I curious about? What do I want to know more about?
So this is in the classroom, this is their approach?
This is in the centres, yes. Yes, it's in the centres and outside as well. So you say, what's the question, and what are the children's theories about that? What do they believe from their life experience? What do they believe about that? And they compare it, they talk about it, they draw their ideas, they might model their ideas, they might role play the ideas, they might bring in experts or parents who know more about it, and gradually they find out more about it. But in the process, they're learning to read and write and speak and make things. It's a very naturalistic process.
So you've been at the heart of some really significant rethinking about particular classrooms, in particular schools in Victoria. Amongst them was Dandenong High School, Warana Primary School in Dandenong as well. Take us to Dandenong and what you did to transform these spaces, to rethink these spaces, to create a space that you think was more in alignment with how children learn, with that natural-born scientist inside them.
Well, I think this brings up another very interesting aspect of this, and that is it's a very collective process. It's a very collaborative process, which design is, isn't it? Design and architecture is inevitably a very collaborative process. And so in the Dandenong case, because it was a very big project, bringing 3 schools together, they set up...
This is Dandenong High?
Yeah. They set up a development team and brought in education experts, a team of... Well, they invited the teachers, who would like to be involved in a process of rethinking how to operate. And so we had a really wonderful group with a principal who was also driving it all. And we used to meet regularly together. And
what did you create together?
We created, and it's just a similar approach that I've taken to several schools now. It's what we call neighbourhoods, or it's bringing together a large group of students with teams of teachers, not a single teacher in a classroom, but teams of teachers. And the large space is made up of smaller differentiated spaces which overall enable people to do a very wide range of things. So, from quiet concentrating research to wet, messy activities to role play. When we did the research at Warana Park, this is just over 20 years ago, and we analysed all the experiences that the children and teachers had within one of these long-term projects, and we came up with a vocabulary of, sort of 10 or 12 discrete settings. So that's what we arrived at. But going back to Dandenong, that was in the early days when the education department was just moving to the idea of having teams of teachers rather than single teachers in a single
So in
class.
a sense, your design work has mirrored a radical education reform process as well in some situations.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and it has to be that, doesn't it?
Yes. And so going back to the fact that these schools are very complex systems driven by ideas and beliefs, and it drives everything. It drives, how you group people, how you manage time, how you look at the curriculum content, how you try and create a joined-up curriculum rather than separate subjects. It's about connections.
And as an interior designer, you had to be kind of in the heart of all those conversations, which is really interesting. People might not imagine an interior designer being part of those sorts of conversations, and you're talking to high school students for their opinions too.
Yes. It was a very interesting team, and the same at Warana Park.
I just want to get a sense, though, of the space that you created, because some people might be imagining it. And Mary wrote an opinion piece in The Age, which I really commend to you, and it was published this week. But it's really having a go at open plan environments, open plan classrooms, open plan offices, open plan. It's where everyone's been going. And a lot of schools have gone open plan thinking they'll fill the classroom with some funky furniture. It's so modern. It looks fantastic. But you hate those spaces. So what you're doing is not open plan, although it's a little bit open plan.
Look, it is a hard environment to describe, although I think this audience would understand what it's about. I suppose if you think about a house, a typical house, which is made up of rooms and corridors, and if you take out some of the walls to open it up so that you've got a fluid space, so it's sometimes called a heterogeneous space or an assemblage of spaces, which mean, and going back to the house, it's exactly that you can move into an area and think, this is a nice place to have a quiet conversation, or this is a good space to go and be active and, sing and dance or whatever. But that they're all connected. And the fact
and you can still see each other.
And that's important.
But you're not...
Exactly.
You can still control your environment to an extent. You've got to keep
visual contact. But what it means is that you've got a sense of being part of a community. You're always part of a community. You can see where people are and what they're doing. So it's... I mean, one of the things about schools that I think makes them incredibly important, and I don't think we realise the potential of schools. They could be wonderful places. They could be, fonts of cultural development. On that score, if we were to see them as, if you think that the curriculum is the sort of the content, the information, the skills that the adult society values, we agree, this is important to pass on. But then you've got the culture of the children, which is so different. If people who are parents with children, and my God, when you're a grandmother and you look at your grandchildren, it's a totally different culture. And you think, and what they're growing into is going to be a different culture again. These sort of research projects, research being a continuation of curiosity really, is bringing those elements together of the adult culture, the skills and knowledge, together with the children's culture. That's what makes it so dynamic and relevant, because those kids are going to develop their own culture later.
I mean, your concern is that existing classrooms, that kind of model of rows of desks and a teacher up the front, isn't preparing kids to do the type of learning that they need for an uncertain world.
No, and in fact, if you look at the rhetoric of the education departments, it is to develop creativity, critical thinking, cooperation, student agency, all these things, which also the corporate sector are crying out for. They're saying, graduates you're sending us don't have these skills, whereas in these long-term inquiry projects, you can develop those skills and aptitudes.
So taking an idea and pursuing it as a group over maybe, instead of discrete subjects and discrete curricula, you might actually be doing one problem over an entire school term. Yeah,
well, for example, a project a couple of years ago which was in a local primary school where the best work is, some really very interesting work is being done. And the whole school was looking at the question of culture, but each sort of age group were doing it in different ways. So the 6 and 7-year-olds were asked, the teachers thought it would be interesting to look at the culture of play because children are the experts in play. So they started off by just talking about, what is it? What is play? What do you play? Where do you play? How do you play? And then they went on excursions. Some went to an old person's residence and where they learned how they played as children, several decades ago. Another group learned about Aboriginal play culture. Another group went to Warana Park because there are many different nationalities there and learned about their traditions. And then they developed ways of telling the rest of the school and the parent community what they'd learnt from this research, you see. So
an amazing all-of-school effort
to
create...
How do you want to communicate that through films, animation? So then they're involved in storyboarding, preparing animations, role
Incredible.
play.
But what's your role then as an interior designer to enable that? What was it about those spaces that you created at Dandenong, at Warana Park and Dandenong High, that really shifted something for those children in terms of how they learn? What can the interior designer do in those sorts of spaces?
Interiors are made up of layers, and I think as a designer you're looking at all of those layers. So it's the shell, the building shell, the built space, as well as the fixtures, the plumbing, the services, the lighting. Have you got natural light in the wet studio? The right sort of finishes and surfaces. You might have a dark space. I usually include a space which is a dark room where you can just control the lighting. So it's working at all those levels. But what the teachers do is to bring in the resources appropriate to whatever the projects that the kids are working on. And so I see our work as sort of, it's a bit like a theatre set, I suppose. It's setting a background which the children and the teachers together then populate. So it needs a lot of resources. It's very different to a classroom where you might just have, paper and pencils and laptop. It requires all sorts of resources to appropriate to whatever's going on. So with the play project, they had shadow screens, they were doing animations.
Resources and the Department of Education. So the educators and the Department of Education is a very, bureaucracies are very conservative. Education is hard to change. Most classrooms are still rows of desks and rows of chairs and a teacher out the front. So what educators need is resources, but they also need to know that something is going to work. So what's the evidence that your approach, developed over many years with collaborations with schools, works?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's my approach. I think this is bringing together threads that go right back to John Dewey, 120 years ago. Marvellous projects in the UK in the 60s. There are all sorts of things that come together in this, but particularly Reggio. The evidence is the documentation, and this is another contribution that the Reggio educators have given us, that the important thing is to document this whole process, bit like, again, the research project, that you've got a record on the walls around you of what you were thinking about, what were the kids' theories about whatever it was. It's on the wall. You can see it. Now, at the end of the project, the play project went on over a year. There are 6 A3 folders of documentation of that project.
Of what works, of what didn't work?
Well, at the end, the teachers will look at it and look at the curriculum, the mandatory requirements, and say, oh yeah, they did that, they wrote, they read, they computed. They tick off all the requirements, but the kids have actually done more than that. They've developed powers of communication, public speaking, taking surveys. They've developed confidence, and character. The other thing is that this approach really draws on differences between the children. So it's not the assumption that every child in the class is the same, but that we value everybody because they're unique and different. They all have different backgrounds, different family backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds. Yeah. And that is the thing that feeds these projects. It's what each individual brings to it. So it's a synergistic process.
Are there things that you would like to tell you've had such an incredible career, and I'm sure some of the questions from the audience will explain, will kind of reveal
explain. I hope they'll explain it.
We'll reveal that. But I mean, the work on the extraordinary furniture designs that you did together with Grant, the extraordinary design very early in your career of the interior of the National Gallery of Victoria.
None of which exists anymore.
Doesn't exist, no, but that beautiful, brutalist exterior does. Are there things that you would like to tell your younger self now?
Oh gosh, that's always the hardest question. Keep learning. I think you just have to keep open mind and keep learning. Yes, I think that's the most important thing.
It's a great motto.
And I think that luck. I mean, gosh, I've been incredibly lucky. Incredibly lucky, but maybe one has to make the most of the luck as well.
You make luck, I think, sometimes. And what about interior designers and architects starting out? What would you like to say to them about the opportunities that are ahead of them?
Oh, look, I think that the profession of design and architecture, and I'm very much part of this, I don't think we've explained to people, or we haven't helped people understand the real power of design. I think the potential of design is enormous. The way of thinking in design, is so powerful, and I think that we need to tell more people.
What potential do you see?
Well, it's the potential to understand need, I think, to understand human need, and the ways that you can bring the physical environment together to support that. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a costly process, but understanding need is I think very valuable. And I think that look, it's changing rapidly, but for too long design was seen as a luxury add-on, not something that was essential.
And certainly in the education system, I can imagine.
Yeah. But I think other cultures, particularly, of course, the Scandinavians, have always understood that design is an essential part of life, and it can.
What's that about, do you think? Because I went to 13 different public schools, and I can, without a doubt, all of them felt like a prison. And they looked like prisons too. They were, especially high schools, they were just depressing, prison-like environments. And yet when you look at schools in the Nordic countries, it's like they're all living in an IKEA catalogue. And what is that about? Why do they have that profound sense of understanding about resourcing and creating beautiful environments in which to give children to learn?
It's a very interesting history, that one. And as I understand it, it goes back to the early 1900s when particularly Sweden was a very poor, illiterate country. And there was a very enlightened politician who decided that that they needed to do things to improve the lives of people, but the lives of everybody, not just a few, but everybody. And he brought together philosophers, architects, poets, engineers, all sorts of people to consider how to do this. And they arrived at the notion that the essence of Swedish culture was the home, the comfort and security of home, and that they would conceptualise this sort of social change as the whole of the country having that quality of comfort and security. So how do you do that? Well, you improve the quality of architecture, you make good housing available, you well, it's the thing that really backed mass production of household goods, so that everybody could afford well-designed goods. And, you can see that leading directly from the 1900s to IKEA.
Yeah.
One of
and
the biggest companies in the world.
That the aesthetic experience also has a utility about it.
Yeah, but it's also connected to the very high value they put on nature. So those two things together, it's heart and soul, plus efficiency coming together.
Yeah. And also this wonderful democratisation of design, which, that's part of the Reggio Emilia approach too, is
Yes.
how can you use design to embed values of democracy and trust and respect in a classroom environment. So that's the sort of stuff you're working with, isn't it?
Exactly.
Using
You're creating
design.
a democracy.
So how do you create, as an interior designer, a space that creates the value of democracy in a child?
Well, one of the things that one of the values and beliefs underlying this collective inquiry approach is that here is the opportunity, one of the unusual opportunities in our society now, to create a democratic community. So one of the spaces I always include is a space that's large enough to hold the whole group. It might be 50, 75, 100, together with the team of teachers. So that is it's an enclosed space, carpeted floor, carpeted steps around the edge. And in that, the whole group will come together regularly, maybe 2 or 3 times a day even, to talk about what they've been doing and what they're planning to do. So it's building that community. And what the Reggio people say, and it drives a lot of visitors mad, particularly in Americans, because they say, so what are your outcomes? And they say, oh, we hope that we are helping to develop participants for a democracy.
Radical act in the classroom. So I'm interested in your thoughts. Do you think that you could see a revolution in Australian classrooms?
I think it's incredibly difficult. Every day I discover new reasons why it is so difficult.
There's a conservatism in education.
Well, but education is a particularly conservative area. And I think that this approach to education is challenging because it's essentially about keeping that curiosity alive. The thing that we see in young children, it's keeping that alive, asking questions, which means that you're not necessarily accepting, you're not as sort of manipulable as you would be in a more conformist setup.
I think that's a very important point you make. The classroom could be a revolutionary space. And isn't that the point of learning, to create independent thinkers? And isn't that the point of good design, to enable that in a classroom?
Yes.
Hey, let's reach out for questions and comments. Any questions from the audience? Thanks so much, Mary. And we'd love to hear from you.
part of it is we need Mary to change the design of this theatre to start with, to have a conversation, two people up the front and this audience all peering down. It goes to all levels, just not in schools.
Yeah.
It's got to continue.
Good point. Good point.
Because of my antique hearing, I missed bits of that.
That we need to design lecture theatres in universities to have a more communal conversation.
Yep.
Yes. Question in the middle, thanks. Red top. Here.
I recently did a subject
Thanks,
over winter at the Willan Centre, which is here at Melbourne Uni at South Bank. They're called Ancient and Contemporary Indigenous Arts too. And I found through the classroom environment created in that, I found it probably the most accommodating, the most welcoming, and actually the deepest learning experience I've actually experienced at the University of Melbourne. And I think what it did was a lot of what you talked about building connection between people. And I ended up writing my final assignment kind of about how by embracing connection in classrooms and also in the way we operate in our systems and kind of breaking away from colonial frameworks can really actually deepen like social change and also deeper learning and kind of just like overall social benefit. And I just felt like I was a lot of connections from what I've been thinking about recently in what you've been saying today.
Yeah. So, but it was a subject that you'd experienced with drawing on Indigenous knowledge. That was a more collectivist design approach, more collaborative, conversational approach within the classroom, but drawing on Indigenous First Nations principles and knowledge,
Oh, hallelujah. Because this is a point I meant to make. It's no accident that Reggio Emilia comes out of a collective culture. It's a very different culture to ours.
The whole city.
Yes. Well, the whole of that northern region of Italy has a long history. It was communist and then it was socialist, and but now it's like Sweden, it's moving to the right. But see, I've been part of many projects over the years that have started with these progressive ideas, and it's happened. Well, John Dewey and other people in other parts of the world have got these wonderful projects going, but then they fail. And it's because they don't have that, supportive community around them.
And as you were saying, these colonialist structures which sort of maintain existing power relationships, don't they, in terms of learning? Interesting. Another question. Thank you. Thanks.
There was one thing, Mary, you mentioned that I'd love to hear more about, which is you mentioned a process of kind of analysing the different experiences that were happening within the school and then identifying settings that go along with that. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that process.
Yes, some 20 years ago when I was asked to work with the team at Warana Park, they had already been working with these sort of long-term inquiries and they'd already made some changes to the environment, but they felt it wasn't really supporting what they were trying to do. And so we set up this project where we worked with the teachers and all the kids to identify all the different experiences that they had in the course of these projects. And we ended up with a wall covered in cards, with one thing on it, like role play or puppet making or something. And so we looked at this and I said to them, look, you can't have a separate room for each of those, but what the designer can do is to analyse that. We look at that and say, that group of experiences needs a studio sort of environment, where you can go and be really wet and messy, either for visual arts or small science or food preparation. So put those together and then you look at another group and say, role play, singing, dancing, whole group gathering, that's another category, and it's very different to the other space. And so we went through like that until we arrived at 10 or 12 different spaces. But then overall are these values that say, but we want it to all be connected. We don't want to hive it off. At the moment, in these 70% of schools, which are largely classrooms, the kids go off for one session a week in a separate specialist art facility.
And now you can have fun.
Yeah. But the point is that you've got to keep the connectivity and the flow of these projects going. So you can't say, okay, that's an interesting idea. No, hang on till 2:00 on Friday and you'll be able to go over to the studio and work on it. You've got to be able to do it, as needed. So that's what drives the whole approach to design.
Does it work differently in primary schools and high schools?
Oh, high schools are so difficult, because the timetable just cuts across everything. Whereas it's hard enough in primary schools. But I've done this with purpose-built new builds, but also with refurbishing. The Warana Park one was a 1970s cheap as chips modular building, and it turned out that was actually the easiest one to work on because you could take out bits of walls. It wasn't hugely costly. Whereas Princess Hill Primary School, where I also spent a lot of time, you've got 100-year-old masonry buildings, and to take a bit of a wall out can cost $60,000 or $70,000. That's a bit restricting.
As an interior designer, you've talked about interior spaces, but I also know as an artist that you work with materials, with natural materials, and think about outside spaces. And I'm curious, with creating schools, if you could talk a bit about inside-outside space and about whether you see fluidity between moving from interior to exterior. And I think when you think about recess or the way schools are structured and organized around when you go outside, mostly for recreation, sometimes for informal play. Is that part of how you were thinking about?
That's the ideal. I haven't been able to realise it anywhere yet, but the outside should be just as fluid and useful as the inside. Again, the Rego people have a very different approach to outdoors to us. And it sort of shocked us because they're quite open, natural, whereas we tend to fill them up with stuff, equipment and hardware. They're much more natural. And I think that there's some English examples, and certainly Scandinavian, they really use the outdoors much more. But no, the idea is like a good kindergarten program where the kids come and go inside and outside. That's what should happen in other schools too. And you should be able to go, to take a science experiment outside.
You mentioned at one point design can't change the world, but it can support it. And I wanted to quiz you on that further. Did you believe that once? Was there a moment when you didn't? What happened? When did you fall out of belief?
When did I see the light? Yeah. Actually, I think it was at Warana Park because we made these changes and it was so exciting and it even excited the education department. And we had busloads of people coming to see it from all over the place and it was wonderful. But teachers do find it incredibly difficult because so much of their training is about control and classroom management. And this is so different. It's about letting go and going with the flow. And it didn't take long before it went back to fairly traditional practice. And I was just amazed that even the complexity of spaces we created, somehow the teachers managed to use it traditionally.
Oh, no.
And now that was a fabulous project, and it's pretty much completely disappeared, as is the case with so many of these progressive projects.
Well, and they need the system to support them, don't they? Let's have another question and then we'll make this our final one.
My question really is about the role that design has in training our educators. What kind of a design thinking can we bring to the curriculum of the future teachers and educators?
There's a very interesting system of schools in Los Angeles called High Tech High. There's a wonderful, wonderful film called Most Likely to Succeed. If anybody's interested, have a look at that. It's absolutely fascinating. Why did I get onto that? Oh, training teachers, that's right. So they had such difficulty finding teachers who could work in this way that they actually set up their own academy. I think that's the way to do it. Because it's a paradigm shift. That's a fact. You can't do it in small increments. It's because the foundations, the underlying beliefs are so different.
Yes, and but you have to change everything really, don't you, if you want to sow the seeds of a revolution?
Yeah, it changes the way you manage time and the way you group people, everything. Yeah.
You're 80 years young. What's on your plate now? What's your priority now?
Change the system.
Revolution. Mary Featherston.